Raindrops began to pummel the pavement as I stood over her body. She was younger than the others, maybe early 20s. Her legs were twisted at odd angles and her shirt was torn, signifying a struggle. I'd only just realized her hair had a red accent beneath the blonde when thunder roared overhead. Her eyes were still wide with terror, an expression of fear frozen in time. I had been too late. Again. The concrete began to soak in the arterial spray in its pores from where her throat had been slit. A 3-foot arch of crimson lay directly in front of her mangled neck. She'd been pinned to the sidewalk when he cut her. Our boy was getting brazen and messy. Sirens began to wail in the distance. I'd already called the body into the local authorities on a burner phone, as I had the others. I made a cross over the woman with my hand and said a silent prayer before making my way across the park to hide behind some shrubbery. A young patrolman was first on the scene. I watched as he frantically called in to dispatch with visibly shaken hands. He pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair as he began to pace in a circle. It was a grisly scene, and no doubt he was still too green to deal with it with any sense of stoicism. Within minutes, there was a swarm of uniforms roping off the area. Camera flashes reflected in gathering puddles near the body as the sky continued to drizzle rain from above. A detective pointed this way and that way like a maestro, shouting out orders to tarp the scene. I hurried off before the feds arrived, not wanting to be seen by their profilers. I crept around an embankment surrounding a small creek where toads cried out noisily. Once down a steep hill covered in evergreens, I was back into the side lot where I'd parked. I removed the plastic baggies from around my boots that prevented any imprints in the soil and threw them in the bed of the truck before climbing in the cab. Images of the 6 women he had already killed circled my mind like a fucked up merry-go-round. All tall blondes, many of them mothers. "Bastard," I whispered, rubbing my eyes and hoping to wipe the pictures from my memory. His killings had been getting closer together. The first one, nearly a year ago. Another, 3 months later. A third, 7 weeks after that. That's when I caught his scent and the hunt began. The next 2 had earned him the moniker, the Blonde Butcher, by the papers. But this last one was reckless. It wasn't nearly as remote as the others. Typically, the bodies were found miles away from civilization, deep within state parks or public hunting lands. But this one was not even a mile from the small town of Yellow Springs. I was so close. Close enough that the blood hadn't even dried yet. But I had still been too slow in deciphering my visions. He was always one step ahead. Sometimes my gift was a little foggy on the delivery, which made it feel more like a curse. I fired up the old truck and took a drive to clear my head. It was time to end the chase. I needed to stop him now, before he killed again. The sun had begun to set over a distant mountain range when I pulled into a motel in the neighboring county. A neon sign shimmered in pools of water within the potholes of the parking lot. Antlers Inn. The L flickered like a strobe, threatening to go out at any moment. It wasn't much to look at, but there would be a bed to sleep in, and more importantly, a tub to see in.
"Just the one night? Are you sure? We have a special going on right now. Pay for 2 nights and get 1 free."
"Thank you, but no. Just for tonight, please."
"All right, just the one then."
The elderly clerk reached behind him with the speed of a sloth and carefully retrieved a key from the hook.
"Room number 4. Checkout is at noon."
He flashed a toothless grin as he dropped a key into my hand. "Thank you." I returned the smile, placed cash on the counter, and pushed my way through the double doors back out into the lot and made my way down to my room. The walls were painted forest green. 2 nightstands shouldered the bed with lamps on each of them. Antlers were glued around the bases of both. The comforter was covered in brown and yellow paisleys that screamed the 70s. It smelled of mildew and mothballs, but looked to be clean at least. I dropped my bag at the end of the bed on the way to the bathroom and flicked on the light. The porcelain tub had yellowed, but looked plenty big enough. I pulled a plastic bag from my pocket and laid it out on the sink. A sigh escaped my lips as I looked down at the Altoids can and handful of dried mushrooms that lay within. I didn't like drugs. I'm sure to some people, a psychedelic experience was eye-opening and a good time. But for me, it was a nightmare. It pushed me deeper into my gift of sight, but sometimes it felt nearly impossible to come out of it. When I was sober, the visions were less intense and very controllable. But when I was high, they threatened to swallow me up like a storm at sea, desperate to drag me down to its murky depths and into the nothingness. I took a last look in the mirror, feeling sympathy for a pair of weary eyes, before opening the bag and shoving a large pinch of mushrooms into my mouth. Their bitterness nearly made me gag. I rinsed them down with water from the faucet. I opened the tin can and pulled out a tab of acid from within. I placed it on my tongue and climbed into the tub, flipping on the cold water with my foot. Although miserable, the cold kept me tethered to my physical body. My limbs began to shiver as the temperature dropped. I closed my eyes and began my meditation as the tub filled. It was always difficult to focus on anything other than the cold at first, but after a few minutes, my mind shifted to a place of static. The white noise roared in my skull as the water covered my ears. Then slowly it dissipated to a complete silence. I felt the first stirrings of warmth in my belly from the mushrooms as I began to drift to the other plane. It was like falling asleep, except it wasn't exactly the same. I felt an invisible rope leading me back to my body as I floated through time and space. At first, there were images: a pale blue farmhouse, clothes hung out on a line to dry, an old woman with wrinkled fingers scrubbing dishes at a sink, a familiar smell of peach cobbler baking in an oven wafted in my nostrils. It was overwhelmingly pleasant. But these were my memories. Even though I wanted to stay, I pushed past them and focused on what I wanted to see. Show me him. Show me the butcher. The setting changed. I now hovered over the crime scenes of the 6 women, each one for only a moment, just enough to revisit the carnage. Then suddenly they were all gathered in a heap in a clearing surrounded by forest. The tops of pine trees brushed my belly as I floated in a circle high above them. Blood pooled beneath their bodies. It was too much blood, more than a person could ever possibly hold in their veins. The trees soaked up the liquid greedily, staining their trunks a vibrant red. Disgust and anger roiled in my gut. I felt my physical body shift in the tub, somewhere far away. Show me the next one. Show me her. I was yanked through the wilderness and across mountaintops so quickly, I felt as if my stomach was in my throat. I came to a screeching halt just over a tin roof. I felt myself vomit in the tub. It was getting too intense. I was losing control. Rose bushes lined a cobblestone path. In a moment I was among them, now as small as a bug. I rested on a pedal and watched as a young woman in a sundress pruned limbs on the shrub next to me. She hummed a beautiful tune as smooth as honey. Freckles splashed across the bridge of her nose and under her blue eyes. Her hair was as yellow as corn silk. She turned to me and smiled. She was beautiful and full of vibrant energy. I could feel the warmth and joy radiating from her, and I was called to it like a bee to pollen. I took a few steps across the rows to come closer to her glow, when suddenly her smile faltered. Her eyes went wide with fear and she began to choke. She cried out for help. I tried to leap towards her, but the force of her cough sent me sprawling backward. I watched in horror as a thin red line crept across her throat. She clawed at her neck and the line opened like a busted seam. Blood poured out from it like a massive waterfall. I tried to scream for it to stop, but I had no voice. It was lost in the sounds of her windpipe gurgling and whistling for air. A shadow appeared over her. I turned to see a hooded figure standing over the both of us. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him.
Show me his face! Show me his face!
I shouted over and over, but his face never manifested. There was only a pitch-black void that lay underneath the hood. I watched in horror as he pulled a large knife from his waistband, and with one hand he gripped her blonde hair, extending her neck further, and with the other he began to saw through the rest of the meat until her head was separated from her shoulders. I felt my body thrashing in cold water, Somewhere so far away I could feel the tether stretched to its breaking point. The hood turned to me, and with one wave of his hand, I was sent sprawling through the air.
No, 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 no!
I screeched, using all of my power to slow down my flight. I had to see a name, a landmark, there. Her mailbox. I smashed against the front of it. I needed an address, anything. I focused all my energy into my body until it grew large enough to pull open the lid of the mailbox. The wind felt like ice against my skin. Searing pain bit at my bones, but I held on. A lone envelope. 4269 Maynard Street, Worthington, Montana. I let go and was sucked through the atmosphere with such force I could feel blood seep from my nose, ears, and eyes. Then there was darkness, the black void of nothing. I was dead. This was death. And I was to become nothing. I had awoken late, near noon, and naked on the bedroom floor of the hotel room. My head had felt like it had been smashed with a sledgehammer. But I had gathered myself, washed the dried blood from my face, and drank enough coffee to kill a man before setting off on the road to Worthington. The sun had begun to set by the time I reached her house. I watched as she walked down the cobblestone path between the roses that lay in front of a brick ranch-style home. It was the same setting, just like I'd seen at the hotel. Her yellow hair was tied up in a bun, and she wore an apron that hung loosely over her blouse. She seemed to be in a rush, but was smiling all the same. She was happy. Beneath my sadness, I felt a tinge of envy. Happiness was never a luxury that belonged to me. I waited until she was in her Suburban and a half a mile down the street before I fired up my old truck and followed loosely. We traveled through an old town littered with flea markets and dollar stores until coming to a stop at Auntie Paula's Cafe. I parked across the road in the lot of a gas station and settled in for my stakeout as she waited tables in the cozy diner. This became my new routine for 2 weeks. 14 days of nothing but watching over her house, the restaurant, and anywhere else she had to go. She never alluded to suspecting that someone watched over her. Her body language was as free and joyful as it had been in my vision, which made me feel even more disgusted by her potential killer. She was easy prey, so innocent, and he would snuff her out all the same, unless I did something about it. I was growing weary of sleeping in my cab and showering at the truck stop outside of town. I was beginning to worry it could be another month of this when I finally noticed someone odd visiting the diner late into a Tuesday night. A gray semi-truck without decals pulled into the side lot. A tall, burly man in a black hoodie and blue jeans exited the truck and sat himself inside at the bar. I looked at the clock, 10:27 p.m. They were due to close in half an hour. He didn't look overly suspicious, but he was certainly not one of the regulars, and something about him put me at unease. But after about 20 minutes and 2 cups of coffee, I watched him leave just as he had come. Nothing unusual happened at all. I thought perhaps I was wrong, and he was just traveling through on his way to pick up a trailer load somewhere down the line. That was until he came in again for the next 2 nights. Same time, same coffee. That didn't sit right. My uncle had been a truck driver his entire life, and he certainly didn't have time to stay in a small town for 3 days because the coffee was good. I had no evidence that this man was the butcher, but it was good enough for me. I decided to make my move. I slithered across the street and into the lot, careful not to draw any attention. The town was already asleep. I doubted anyone would notice anyway, but I was discreet all the same. I opened the passenger door and climbed through the cab to the back sleeper area. There was a small mattress with a wadded-up comforter in the corner. I'd be spotted easily during the day, but I was betting on the night to conceal me enough to gain the element of surprise. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps. My pulse raced in my throat as he opened the door. The dome light kicked on overhead. I kept myself as small and flat as possible as he climbed into the driver's seat. I let him turn over the engine, and then I pulled the .38 revolver from its holster before quickly sitting up straight and pressing it against the base of his skull.
"Oh, Jesus Christ!"
He croaked.
Quiet.
I hissed.
What do you want? My wallet's in my pocket. You can have it.
I don't want your money. What are you doing here? I pressed the barrel deeper into his skin.
What?
He stammered. You heard me. What are you doing here? I growled.
I'm just getting coffee, man. What do you want? Anything. You can have it.
I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. He sounded genuinely afraid. But it could just be an act. Coffee for the past 3 nights just before the diner closes? I nudged the barrel against his head twice, causing it to bob forward, showing I meant business.
Look, I'm just in town for a funeral. My cousin died, man, that's all. Just here for a funeral. The coffee helps me relax. I have money.
I could see tears flowing down the man's face in a stream. I suddenly didn't think this was the butcher.
I have kids. Tommy and Lily, I have kids. Please.
He began to blubber, nearly sobbing. Damn, I made a mistake. This was wrong. I'm sorry, I whispered before bringing the butt of the revolver down hard on the back of his head. He went out like a light, his face slamming against the steering wheel. I pulled him back by the shoulders and put a pillow against the window for him to lean on. As I climbed out of the cab, I turned the key to shut off the truck before quickly scampering out into the darkness to get into my own.
Fuck!
I shouted, throwing my baseball cap onto the floorboard. I ran my fingers through my hair, racked with guilt. That poor man might need some therapy after that, but at least he'll live and wake up with nothing more than a headache and a lump on his head. I sighed deeply and rubbed my hands over my face. I was getting too old for this, and maybe too soft. Or perhaps I just didn't have enough soul left to give anymore. Each murder, each vision, they all took a little piece of it, and perhaps I was just scraping the bottom of the barrel at this point. Maybe it was time to retire. I looked over to the diner. The lights were off. Wait, her car. It was already gone. They must have closed a few minutes early. Damn. I threw it in reverse, nearly squealing the tires, and took off through town. I wasn't sure why, but I had a terrible feeling in my gut. It could have been my very recent needless assault on an innocent man, but I didn't think so. The moon was full, and something in the air forebode something sinister. As I came down Maynard Street, my headlights spilled across the brick ranch. Her car was in the driveway, but the front door was left wide open. I sped through her front yard and barely threw it into park before jumping out from the cab and sprinting into the house.
Hello, ma'am? Police!
I lied, shouting into the empty living room and pulling my .38, holding it at my side. A scream rang out from down the hall.
Ma'am?
I shouted, running to the rear bedroom. I burst through the door to see her in the corner of the room, holding a bleeding forearm, her eyes wide with fear.
Are you okay? Where is he?
She pointed behind me. I spun around just in time to see him lunging from the master bathroom and burying a Bowie knife just below my collarbone. I howled in pain as we both tumbled to the floor. He brought the blade high above his head, ready to strike again. But I put up my hand in the nick of time. It slid through my palm like butter. I screamed as I raised my revolver, burying it just under his rib cage and emptying the entire cylinder into his chest cavity. His mouth went slack, and his eyes rolled into the back of his head as he fell to the side. I pulled the knife from my hand and crawled towards her.
Are you okay?
I asked.
Yes. Are you?
I think so. But I knew better. It was getting harder to breathe. I could feel blood soak the front of my shirt from the wound that had collapsed my lung.
I'm so glad I got here in time.
I coughed blood onto the hardwood floor. It was too much blood. I struggled not to drown in it. The room started to spin. I saw her leap from the corner and grab her cell phone from the nightstand. Blood stained the front of her apron, but she seemed okay. I was so glad she was okay. I could hear her frantically begging for an ambulance as I slipped into darkness. I was just glad she was okay. I finally saved one. After I had woken up in the hospital, there were a dozen flowers from the woman I'd saved. Her name was Emily, and she really was the kindest person I'd ever met. Then came the barrage of interrogations by the local PD. I'd come up with the phony story that I was visiting a friend. He was on hard times after his cousin had just died, and I wanted to cheer him up. and on my way out of town, I happened to hear a scream come from a house where the front door had been suspiciously left open. It was late at night, and I was worried it was a break-in. My suspicions had been right, and I'd saved the woman from her attacker. It was a classic Good Samaritan tale built upon half-truths, and they bought it without a doubt. Luckily, they hadn't put two and two together yet. They didn't know that this man was linked to the other murders. The FBI would conduct a much more thorough investigation once it was confirmed, and they would figure it out eventually, but by then I'd be long gone. I had told myself I was going to retire, move on, and live the rest of my life in simplicity. But that was a week ago, and now I was hot on the trail of another killer. It was going to be a long drive to Brooklyn, but there was a man there about to commit his second murder, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.